As you know, I invited you over for this chat, mainly due to the terribly unfortunate circumstances surrounding Jeremy's passing. But honestly, and maybe more importantly, to kind of highlight how Jeremy touched a lot of people personally and professionally. You were, I think, one of those people. So I guess first things first, I want to ask you, how did you meet Jeremy, and if you could highlight a bit how he influenced you over the years?
Sure. Well, first, I also want to provide you, to thank you not only for inviting me, but also to kind of provide the field with this opportunity so that uh, we can remember Jeremy and we can also hear voices uh, who were close to him, who were very privileged. And I know you have invited a lot of other people, and I certainly feel really privileged to be in this group of people who uh, have been both those two issues. I really appreciate the opportunity of both talking about from a relationship perspective and influential perspective. They've been so important. The first time I met Jeremy was at my first presentation ever in SEPI. It was actually my first presentation as a graduate student. It was my first presentation in English, if we can call that English. And so I was obviously very nervous. And then I got even more nervous when I saw him. And I decided to go into approach him. In fact, approaching him in the first few minutes that I spent there, I was more nervous than giving my first talk in English. To me, I was so impressed by his work and the reading that I did, and it just felt like it's like felt what I was saying as I was saying them. It felt so embarrassing that the way I was talking about his work, and you could clearly see that he was in some ways a little bit embarrassed by what I was saying, and then I felt like, oh my God, this is not really going very smooth. But this led to his first, Jeremy had a lot of gesture of kindness toward me, and this was one of his first one, where he actually kind of allowed me to kind of change subjects. It was kind of awkward, but change subjects, and then he stayed there. He was not dismissive. He was smiling, and you could really see, like, okay, this young guy is really wants to move, and I'm just going to facilitate that. And
Wow.
Jeremy and I had in a kind of a unique connection. We were both Canadian, on different side. He was on the English side, I was on the French side, and so we had something so we could actually talk about Canadian politics. But I remember thinking, wow, this guy was not only skilled, but he was also very kind of kind, right? And to get me out of that, because I had felt so embarrassed. And then this was right at the time where Jeremy actually left Toronto. He was working in Toronto, and with Sindel Eagle, and he left to take a job at Adelphi University, which is on Long Island, New York. And that was at the time where I was beginning my PhD at Stony Brook with Marv Goldfried. And Stony Brook is also on Long Island. And I remember, I don't know who was the person who came up with this, if it was Marv, if it was me, but anyway, I invited Jeremy to be on my dissertation committee, which did not do anything to reduce my anxiety about it. He came up with a second gesture of kindness. So I'm defending, and as you know, you defend, and then you get out the room, and the committee member talks, and then they bring you back, and everybody shook my hands, right? All the committee and congratulating me, and except Marv, my advisor, who kept asking me questions. Well, we could, for the publications, we could do that. And then Jeremy just started and said, Marv, stop. He has just defended. And Marv kept going, and Jeremy kind of said, Marv, that's it.
Wow.
That's it. So he kind of like allowed me to kind of get out of the situation, which of course became a big joke between the three of us.
Uh-huh.
And interestingly, throughout our collaboration up until the end, there were a lot of those kind of gesture of kindness, but also at some point there were different type of gesture that became very, very meaningful to me, which were meaningful of gesture of respect. They were above and beyond writing me letters, which was recommendations, which of course I greatly appreciated. But at some point, I don't know exactly when, but at some point I noticed that he was providing me praise, either publicly or personally, at conferences. He would introduce me, and then he would say something, that was above and beyond the Call of Duty. He'd make comments as a discussant, and I really feel sorry that I never told him that these were actually really, really meaningful, that he actually publicly kind of were. And I had a sense that somehow for him, it was like a sense of both pride and pleasure of seeing somebody that he had mentored early in his career. And now he was in a panel with me, and he was kind of like, even though I did not feel that, but he was treating me like a colleague, like a collaborator, right? And he was doing it explicitly, and that was, just very meaningful. And I made sure that over the years, every time that I could, whether it was during my SPR presidential address or when I would be receiving awards, that I would actually explicitly kind of recognizing Jeremy as one of the few luminaries in the field that, because of their kindness, their trust, their friendship, eventually, really kind of, help actualize me facilitate my actualization from a professional perspective. And there was a number of very kind of, again, with regard to the relationship, also moment that was interesting. For example, the first chapter that I wrote in English, perhaps the first publication that I had in English, was co-author with Jeremy. So we were writing a book chapter in the End Book of Psychotherapy Integrations, the first volume by John Norcross and Marv Goldfried. And Marv, Jeremy, and I wrote the last chapter of this. So I just felt like this was so proud, and I was so proud of that. And Jeremy also accepted to be a consultant in NIMH grants that we had at Penn State for many, many years. And it became a tradition that he would come and stay at our house. And so we had these, wonderful dinner and wonderful time just talking with him. And from these contacts, Jeremy and I also started intensively for many, many years writing grant proposal together. I don't know how many we wrote. They were all rejected, but wrote several grant proposal together. And so I then had a kind of a sense of what it was to kind of work with him also. And of course, at a personal level, there have been, over the years, at conferences, so many opportunities. Whether it was conferences that we attended together, or conference at Penn State that I organized with Clara Hill, where he would be coming, where there would be a lot of laughter, and there would be also a lot of really personal discussions. And one of the things that was really remarkable with having discussions with Jeremy is you could easily move from a kind of a chit-chat and smiling and talking about Canadian politics and the difference between Canadian politics and American politics, and kind of rapidly shifting to something very deeply, appropriately, but very deeply personal. And so you can actually kind of move from a kind of a sense of light discussions and also to something that was, because I think Jeremy was such a deep thinker that it was very easy for him to move from a chit chat to talking about things that were, very important at a personal level. Sometimes it would start with theory, and then we would link that to personal. Sometimes it would be the reverse. But it was remarkable how it's been very rare for me to encounter people. Really takes like a mind who was so immersed in his work, where you could actually very easily and not feel like this was a show or this was boring or this was a test, that you can actually talk about the enactment of whatever the work was meant clinically or personally, and so there's been over the years many dinner, many drinks with Jeremy of, just in those wonderful places, and just really having a sense like this was so fulfilling. This was such a great moment that I had. So I was very, very fortunate from a personal relationship with him.
It seems like, it really feels like you admired him at many different levels, from how much of a scholar he was, but then how kind and just genuinely curious and empathic he was. I'm wondering, looking at now from the perspective of right now, how do you think his influence on your life kind of lives on, either personally or professionally?
Well, I'll tell you, concretely how it's still very concrete. How basically, in some ways, its influence is still very kind of living on. Is still very, very integrated. But when I was preparing, the things to say, how to kind of wrap up and to put into words, the influence that he has. I actually went back and and it had confirmed my intuitions that I had cited Jeremy in my first publications in French in 1986 and 1987. So it was really, really there present. He was also a very, very present when I went to Stony Brook to do my PhD. I went back and, I think all the papers that Marv Goldfried and I wrote, we cited Jeremy, so during grad school and after grad school.
Mm-hmm.
So he has always been, present since the late 80s, the 90s. And of course, his research on alliance rupture really had shaped my studies. The first, there was this amazing paper with a number of co-authors that are now prominent figure of SPR. Shelley McMain, for example, is an author on the very famous psychotherapy paper in 1990, where he actually start presenting signs, marker of alliance ruptures and some of the strategy to deal with. And this was like a gift when I read this paper from the research gods when I was writing up my book. So in my dissertation, I find that there was a significant relationship between the therapeutic alliance and outcome in cognitive therapy, positive, and there was also a significant relationship between the therapist's adherence to the cognitive model and outcome, but it was negative.
Yeah.
And I did some content analysis, and what I kept seeing is like it was not the technique per se, but it's the way it was used. People were adhere more to the technique or to the rational when the client were voicing reluctance or resistance about engaging in the rational. And in fact, statistically, when I control for the alliance, that relationship between adherence and outcome stopped being significant. So it was really kind of, it's not the technique per se. And I was reading that in the text, and I was saying, oh my God, look at what the therapist is doing now. There's clear sign of something, and then the therapist is just doing the same thing that put them into trouble. And then I read that paper, and I was like, oh my God,
Here it
well,
is.
this is. And it was also an amazing 1996 GCCP paper that he published, task analysis on alliance rupture with Chris Moran. And these papers actually, I do remember, were not only did it help me to kind of, say something, have something to say about my content or qualitative findings in my dissertations, but also they were the pillar of my first independent study. So my first independent study was, I tested whether or not can you train cognitive therapists to apply a treatment manual, the CT for depression. But then when there's an alliance rupture, contrary to what I find in my dissertation, can you actually have people to kind of say, okay, we're not going to do more of the same.
Right.
And it was really basically that paper, the 1990 paper in the task analysis, that was saying, okay, so I basically create a treatment manual out of that, taking some of, essentially his stuff. It was a treatment manual, was his work and the work of David Burns. So basically just saying, okay, so when confronted with that, when the client is saying, no, I don't want to do this anymore, how to basically meta-communicating, right? Mm-hmm. So this had been, so crucial. But I also have to say that even before those papers, when I was in Montreal, when I was an undergraduate student and graduate students in Montreal, writing a master thesis, for example, on common factors, that I had come across the name of this young Canadian, and I was reading some of the text that he was publishing on the assessment of
interpersonal schemas,
implicit cognition,
yeah,
the assessment of affect in cognitive therapy, the assessment of unconscious processes in cognitive therapy. He was at Clark, I was like, who is this guy? And these were the papers, by the way, that made me so insecure at the first SEPI meeting when I approached him. It was not the repair paper. That was before the repair paper. It was like, oh my God, this guy is bringing, it's like the return of the repressed in the world of cognitive therapy. It's like, we need to talk about the unconscious. We need to talk about odd cognitions, And I was so impressed by his scholarship and his eloquence of writing, but I have to say that even more than the alliance rupture papers, and even more than these papers on the beginning of his work, which a lot of these papers were published in a fantastic book, which is Expanding the Scope of Cognitive Therapy. It's a great book that he edited.
Yeah,
but to me, the papers that as literally has been the pillar of my own intellectual and clinical development were two papers he published in Clinical Psychology Review, 1990. These were kind of a summary and extensions, in a way, of the book that he wrote with Zindelziegel. Mm-hmm. And he presented in such a concise way his new model about interpersonal schema.
Right.
And from where I stand, I think in the world of integration, it is to me still the most insightful and useful integrative model that we have if you're a cognitive therapist, because that is a model of of interpersonal schema allow cognitive therapists to integrate in a very cohesive way dimensions about interpersonal issues, developmental issues,
Right.
emotional issues, but also conflictual issues. So kind of a conflicts between different motivations that the CBT scholars have not paid enough attention to. And I can't tell you the number of places where I cited this paper. I cited this paper when I described the course that I've given CBT,
Yeah.
when I have talked about how I supervise,
Mm-hmm.
and also all the papers that, because these papers in the book with Zindel were really the conceptual model that guided the integration, the integrative therapy that we conducted at Penn State with integrated interpersonal focus and emotional focus dimension into CBT to treatment of the GAD.
Yeah.
And the way for us to actually kind of do that, right? The way that we can actually do that is we needed a model that allowed that.
Yeah.
And, kind of, fortunately, Jeremy provided this to us. He really kind of did provide a model. We can say it's not just going to be kind of like a artificial integration, but it's going to be a seamless integration. And that, and we work with Jeremy in terms of, like how to implement this. And I have to say, by the way, that I think in a way, my unfinished business about the field's reactions toward Jeremy is we're focusing a lot on alliance ruptures and alliance repair, as we should, recognizing his major contribution as well as the contributions, of course, of Chris Moran and Catherine Eubanks. And it's really important that we do so. But it is also important to recognize that this is a guy who had really broad conceptual. He was such a great mind. And he really kind of offered to the field.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, it's similar to Mike Mahoney, but perhaps a little bit more, more focus, more structure. It's not saying anything bad about Mike Mahoney, but it's just saying like Jeremy had the same kind of mind. And we in theory, we failed to recognize some of his contribution. But I also think that Jeremy himself, Schwartz himself, sold himself short in terms of as a researcher. If I don't know if you were there in Israel when he received the SPR Distinguished Award, but he was saying he received it with at the same time as Paul Chris-Christoph received it, and he said, I'm so proud and so happy, and I'm so happy that SPR is able to kind of give the same award to a researchers like Paul and a theoreticians, somebody from a conceptual perspective. And I remember just feeling like, oh man, you're selling yourself short. He really kind of had a lot of research skills, and I actually saw this, in not only in the task analysis paper, but also in writing, in a lot of the grants that we were writing together for years and years, and also like more recently, which also took place where this is where his influence is still and his presence is still living on, and his last gesture of kindness toward me took place was also in the context of writing a grant with him, as well as with Chris and Catherine on that.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Is there any?
So yes, and let me tell you a little bit about about this, to kind of address more directly your question. So how his influence is still there. So after a hiatus of many years, so we applied all those grants, and we didn't get funded, and then we went on our separate ways, and we did stuff separately, and maybe 10, 12, 15 years later, seeing us regularly, he would come to the Penn State conference. We would see each other at conferences. We had decided, okay, let's go back, let's jump back. And this time, let's make sure to have Chris Moran and Catherine Eubanks on the team. So let's be more than just like a pair. Let's build this team,
Mhm.
And so we started. I was beginning my sabbatical. It was in the beginning of the summer 2017, and the four of us were working very hard. You kind of like reading about the NIMH, but also thinking about what to do, and we were regularly talking over the phone, conference call, and advancing the project. And it was a main element of my sabbatical. And it was very pleasant, very stimulating. There were alliance rupture, as you might expect, which we worked through them. I had some issues, some things he was making me anxious about, and we were able to process this and work, which just felt like, oh, it's so, again, a signs of just a gesture of kindness, but also a gesture of respect, kind of like, okay, we can talk about this issue. And it's always tough, when you work in something very, very demanding as a grant proposal, and all the issues of there's a co-ownership, but there's also kind of like who is taking the lead? And
Right.
of course, there's always some tension that comes up, and it was kind of remarkable about how we were able to talk about these. But the last gesture of kindness came. It was we had a conference call that was set, and in the morning I sent an email to Catherine, Chris, and Jeremy, and say, you guys, I'm having something. It's a flu or something, and I can't, I can't get it out. I mean, I can't solve it. So I'm going to need to see a physician, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to find an appointment. So it was an early email saying, I'm going to let you know if we need to cancel our conference call there. And the three of them, very kindly says, sure, so just let us know, and so I went back, to this exchange. So the second email that I sent after that first one, which was after I set up the appointment, I write copain, copine, which is friends in French. And I wrote, well, the only time which I was able to schedule the medical appointment is during our scheduled conference call. And shortly after that, Jeremy responded, no need to apologize, Louis. Your health should take priority. And the should was capitalized. And he wrote this email on Monday, May 7th, 2018, at 10:58, which is just a few hours before he was killed. So, I want to say, we're going to recognize him as a great mind, but also it's such a kind soul. We don't want to forget the kind soul and the irony of him, and treating me with this kind of gesture of kindness and real. I mean, he capitalized that. The day he died, talking about my health. And so, in my mind, it's important to kind of recognize him for who is that person that can actually do that. And it's a person with really disarming smiles, tender hugs, who could be so present and so kind. And of course, as you might expect, when that happened, which was really kind of like in the middle of the project. So Chris, Catherine, and I kind of like took took a distance, and now we're back. We're back in a way, kind of really integrated as much as we can, and also as I as I think it should be, also kind of sharpening our own work, so that the presence of Jeremy is always there, but the contributions is also becoming something different, allowing us to find actualizations into this, while at the same time still being very clearly anchored over the influence that in some ways is, in French would say innommable. You can't name this. It's just there. It's like this amazing, engaging piece of music, which you would want to be able to kind of say, this is to describe it. The Third Symphony of Beethoven, you would want to kind of like, you can say, well, this piece of music changed everything. That symphony changed everything, make the field move from classical music to romantic music. What it did was earth-shattering. You can say that, but to actually put into words what you experience and what we owe, when we listen to it and when we think about it, well, that we just have to accept the fact that we cannot name that. It's not describable. You can't describe that.
Louis, I want to thank you so much, because I'm really moved by everything you shared. And it's one thing to talk about the scholarly achievements of Jeremy or the theoretical developments, but I think you've given this whole other side that I know personally that a lot of people have felt. And it's so great to especially this last email that you shared. It's such an incredible full circle for
It
the
is.
story that you gave us.
It is. It is. It is really, in a way, I didn't think about this, but in a way, right, it's very similar
Exactly.
to the kindness of the first time, when he saw that I was there, stuck, feeling embarrassed because I embarrassed him, and then trying my way to get out of this and say, okay, we're going to stop talking about your work and how much I admire this work, and let's talk about, and then to kind of, don't worry, that's fine.
Yes.
It's great. Don't worry about it. That was essentially the message that he was giving me then, and the message that he was giving me at the first time, and the message that he was giving. Don't worry, don't worry.
That's really moving. Thank you so much, Louis, for sharing all this.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.